I think of my books as being filled with a lot of quiet history. The tonic that will solve all your health problems. I actually wrestled with myself for a month. A person that just enjoys reading any kind of historical fiction would probably enjoy the books. They feel like they're getting a window on history.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Regency History interviews particularly with authors right now. We're talking with authors about their historical research. My name is Andrew Knowles, and today I'm talking to Jennifer Delamere from the US. So Jennifer, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Jennifer has written a number of Victorian romances, historical fiction romances, and that's what we want to be digging into today. And she's particularly made a thing of using the online newspaper archive that's available. So we'll get into that detail a bit later on. But to start with, Jennifer, what got you into writing historical romances in the first place?
Well, I guess I've always been a big lover of history. I enjoy reading history books almost more than novels, really, which is interesting since I write novels. But when I decided I wanted to try my hand at writing, I started writing a few contemporaries, but I found that I was more comfortable writing in the historical time period. I like to joke that I couldn't do contemporaries because I'd get the details wrong.
I like that one.
I feel like I live in the past sometimes.
Yeah, and certainly your reviewers are very complimentary. I've got some reviews here. You've written, is it right? You've written 9 books. You've published 9 books.
That's right.
You've probably written more, but 9 of them are published. And you got reviews such as, I made a note of some of them here. So this book provides an interesting look at the practice and importance of telegraphy. Telegraphy, is that how you pronounce it? I should have practiced
Telegraphy?
that. Telegraphy in the 1880s. There are also tidbits of history woven throughout. That's a review, part of a review on your book line by line. Another review says on a different book, the historical medical details Delamere provides add a fascinating overview to the romance between dynamic, intelligent characters. I like that, dynamic, intelligent characters. So yeah, there's a lot there about history. And The Captain's Daughter, another book that you've written, there's a review. Jennifer Delamere has combined her interests in Victorian life, theatre and orphanages into an engaging historical romance. While the streets and neighbourhoods of 1880s London, their people and their lifestyles are brought vividly to life, it's the staging of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas that captures our imagination. The workings of the theatre are blended well into the plot. And I've included that one because my wife Rachel is a big fan of Gilbert and Sullivan's. She used to sing in them when she was younger.
Oh, how wonderful. I always wanted to, but I don't have the talent.
So Gilbert and Sullivan, but very Victorian. So you obviously put a lot of history into your novels. So would you describe your novels as being historical fiction or being romances, or what sort of, where would you categorize them?
Well, they're technically historical romance. I also think of them as historical fiction. The romance is definitely a big part of the books, but I feel like a person that just enjoys reading any kind of historical fiction would probably enjoy the books. And they are Christian fiction as well. My publisher is a Christian publisher. And so that element is in there too. But I try to make it more natural to how the Victorians thought at that time, because we know they were very much interested in things spiritual as well as scientific.
Yes. You're published by Bethany House. Is that right?
That's right.
You've obviously got a strong bias towards history in your novels. So I'm guessing the answer to this question is already obvious, which is how important is the history to your readers?
Oh, I think it's incredibly important. They feel like they're learning history when they read my books a little bit, or they feel like they're getting a window on history. And the feedback I get from readers is that they really like that. So I try to be really careful to be accurate in my details as much as I can.
I love reading historical novels. I have since I was very young. I think some of the earliest novels I read were historical. Can you remember what the name of the first historical book that you read was? Novel rather than a non-fiction?
Probably I'm not sure if these count or not, but my favorite author in high school was Mary Stewart. And I was reading her in the 70s, so her books were somewhat historical since she wrote these romantic suspense books in the 1950s. I started reading also some Gothic romances. And then later on, I got into other things. I like some of Bernard Cornwell's stuff, actually.
Right. Right.
I read a variety, not all romance. And of course, I read a lot of Regency romances as well.
Georgette Hayes?
Yeah, I came to her later on in life, but I love her books.
Yeah, she's held up as the sort of paragon of historical romance, isn't she, in the Regency era?
Mm-hmm. Of course, I read books from the time,
yes,
probably more than historical, Dickens and Jane Austen.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And of course, there were a huge number of books published in the 19th century, all the way through, many of which, of course, haven't survived to today. I mean, you can get to them online, and we'll talk about being online resources in just a moment. But of course, yes, we think of Dickens, or we think of Austen, and there are other authors that come to mind. But of course, there were hundreds and hundreds of authors whose books have just vanished because they didn't stand the test of time.
A recent reader told me that my storyline reminded her of a book by George Gissing. And so I had to go look up who he was and what the book was. And
right.
Sure enough, there were some similarities. And so I kind of got a kick out of that.
Excellent. That's not a name that I'm particularly familiar with, I have to say.
He was another 19th century writer.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about how you approach the research for your novels. Give us some insights into that.
Well, when I decided I wanted to set my books in the Victorian times, because I figured out that's where my mind was ever since. Well, the first theater show I ever saw as a 6-year-old was the musical Oliver, which of course is based on Oliver Twist.
Yeah. And
then when I was about 12, my parents started taking me to local Savoy Yard productions of Gilbert and Sullivan, which is where that comes in. But I knew that I wanted to get a kind of a thorough feeling for the Victorian time period. So I started with this book called Victorian London by Liza Picard. And it covers 1840 to 1870. And so my first book was set in mid-Victorian London. And that's where I got a lot of my plot ideas from for my first book. And I wanted to include the Great Exhibition of 1851. So which I read all about in this book. And that was kind of the foundation for how I got started. And I've read a whole bunch of others. This bookcase behind me is mostly Victorian history.
But of course, we talk about the Victorian era, and I was talking with Rachel about this, the fact that, well, we've got this book about Victorian street life, but of course, the Victorian age covered 60 plus years. I mean, and early Victorian is much more akin to, well, it follows on obviously from late Georgian. It's a very different world from the other end of the Victorian, which is early 20th century. And technologies and society have moved on massively in that time. So when you talk about Victorian, that's a massive time span, really, isn't it?
It is. It's like saying, oh, I'm going to write a book set in the 20th century. Well, 1910 looked a lot different from 1990. And, and the 19th century was just the same. And so I also took one of the great courses lectures on the Victorian era, and the man broke down, early, mid, and late Victorian times. And so I decided I really tended more towards the middle and late, because I enjoyed adding things like the advent of the railway and telegraphy and photography. So I cover all of those developments in my books, and that's been a lot of fun.
Excellent. So that sounds a little bit technical, actually. You're talking about photography and telegraphy and that sort of thing, and the operation of theatres. So you enjoy that side of things.
I do. And my husband enjoys photography as well. And we had a place in our town that actually still did wet plate photography, which is a very 19th century process. And so we were able to really get some great sort of kind of hands-on work with that, which was a lot of fun.
Cool. That does sound interesting. It's great to be able to get hands-on with some of these older technologies. one author I was talking to particularly, she liked to get hold of material that was the material that they used at the time, to get the feel of it and the texture in order to be able to write more accurately about it. So it sounds like a very similar approach that you're taking.
Yeah, that's a great thing. I was on a panel for the Historical Novel Society that we talked about research through primary sources and what another author called touch and try.
Yes.
And that is the materials of the time, the food of the time, you know, anything you can do to get your other senses involved. It was a great workshop.
Yeah. And obviously you're based in the US, but you've traveled to the UK a few times now. So you've obviously experienced places like London for yourself firsthand.
Yes. Yes, I've been to London 4 times now.
And how helpful is that in terms of doing research?
It's very helpful. You can still see a lot of the buildings that were there in Victorian times. You can walk the streets, and I enjoy doing that. I enjoy taking the underground. Of course, the underground was already built by the 1880s when most of my books take place, and so I have some scenes set there as well. Because most people think of Victorian London as hansom cabs, which of course it was, but the underground was also there. So yeah, and I found walking around places like Mayfair and down at the Embankment and going to the Victorian house museums that are still around, Charles Dickens, and
yes.
And I also visited the House Museum of Jane and Thomas Carlyle in Chelsea. It's a tremendous house museum. But that was very helpful. And then when I did research on George Mueller, who had orphanages in Bristol, I went up there and was able to actually see the buildings, which still exist, even though they've been repurposed to other things. That was very cool. I enjoyed that greatly.
Yeah, I can imagine. In fact, we had a family event in the gardens of one of those buildings a summer or two back, because it's still being used for charitable purposes. It's just, yes, as you say, it's being repurposed, that particular one. Yeah, and of course, talk about being in London and Charles Dickens. Of course, Dickens spent a lot of his time walking around London, didn't he? And yeah, I mean, I don't know how you took the underground, obviously, but I'm sure you did a lot of walking as well.
Oh, yes. And I walked several of the places, like out at Coram Fields and where the old medical school for women was, which is now another kind of medical building, just to get the feel for how long would that take.
Yes.
You know, if I said my character walked from here to there, how feasible was that? So it was fun to just get the feel of the place.
Yes, yeah, and London's quite amusing in a way, because they say that the average speed of traffic in London actually isn't much different now as it was back in the time of Charles Dickens.
Yeah, I'm sure it's clogged up in other ways, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the newspaper archive, because I know that's something that you've spent a lot of time in. So yeah, give us some sort of outline thoughts about how useful the newspaper archive is.
Well, the British Newspaper Archive is amazing. They have, from the 1700s up until the 20th century, scanned all these newspapers, and you can search them. You can do word searches. And I've used them for all kinds of things, from plot ideas to just getting some details. And again, finding out if things are feasible. And also to get a feel for instance, I read theater reviews to get a feel for how people felt and thought and spoke about the theater in those days. It's an endless resource.
Yeah, I mean, I find when I look at old newspapers, I get lost in the adverts.
Yes,
because it's just fascinating to read all these advertisements for things.
Yes, the tonic that will solve all your health problems, and women's complaints and all sorts of things. But I looked up the advertisements for rooms to let when one of my characters was going to be searching for new housing.
Okay.
And yeah, so it's like, how feasible was it to rent a place? I settled on Islington in the northern part of London, and got a lot of great details from the newspaper.
Yeah, because I guess that tells you the sort of things that people considered to be important at the time.
Yes, and I learned a lot of great phrases, such as for for gentlemen who are engaged during the day, which was a polite way of saying you have to work for a living rather than being a man of independent means.
Yes.
So a lot of great sort of euphemisms like that.
So I believe you've got a screen there with some of the archive on it.
I do.
Do you want to show it to us?
Okay, so you can see that now?
Yeah, that's on the screen. So
Okay.
now we can start talking about it. So you're showing us the screen here from the British Newspaper Archive. Now at the top it talks about the fact that you're a subscriber to this, and of course the archive is a fantastic resource, but it's not free, is it?
No, it's about £78 per year.
Yeah, which if you think
you
about
have to really want to use it, which for me came out to $98, I think.
Right. Okay. But if you think, but for the wealth of information in there, it's I mean, what's $98 or it's the price of a few books, isn't it? But you've got thousands and thousands of articles, and I don't know how many hundred publications, but there's a huge number of resources on there.
There is, and then when you go to the home screen, you can search by all kinds of ways, by the publication title, the name, the year, and you can really narrow it down to what you want. And then you can save the articles that you like so that you can find them again. So I've got all of the things that I did, and here's my favorite one, which is the articles about the comet of 1881, which I managed to squeeze into 2 of my books because I was so fascinated by it.
I have to say, I mean, Victorian isn't my speciality, so I'm not aware of the comet of 1881. But do you mind going into one of these and showing us a little bit more about what it says?
Oh, sure.
So we can see.
So when you do that, it shows you, like, here's the article about the comet, and you can make it larger to read.
So what are we looking at here? Sorry. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the Dundee's People Journal. So Dundee is a town in Scotland. So this is a local newspaper from 1881, and it's talking about the comet.
What I also found is that a lot of newspapers will have the same article because they shared information. And so this article would probably have occurred in others as well. I think I just found the best one here. I saved this particular one.
Yes.
So, and then on the left, it has the text, which you can also, it's scanned, so it isn't always accurate, but you can edit it. And then you're doing a favor for future readers, because this text on the left is how it scans for the word searches that you're doing. Right.
Okay. So you're not only using it as a resource for yourself, but you're also, by correcting any errors in the scanning, you're helping future researchers to get a better result.
That's right.
Oh, that's great.
And then you can also you can cut and paste this part if you want to put it in a Word document for yourself for future reference. So that's helpful. And I just love, again, you get a sense of how they talked, what they thought. This comet was visible to the naked eye, so that's why it was so spectacular. And I read about how they had comet watching parties. And so I put those in my books as well. They all went out, gathered as crowds with their friends to look at the comet together.
No, that's fascinating. Now, obviously, you've got a lot of text here. How about pictures?
There are pictures. Let me go back.
Because, of course, I mean, you talked about photography earlier on, but I'm guessing for a lot of the earlier newspapers, obviously photographs weren't a thing, but they did have a lot of illustrations, didn't they?
They did have illustrations, and they had the Illustrated London News, which you can get some of those. So here was a picture of the comet as put into this Illustrated London News.
Right.
But they have, there are other places too. I didn't find so much photography as mostly drawings.
Yeah, I don't off the top of my head know when photography became a thing in newspapers. Certainly, I think illustrations, I think from about the 1850s onwards, that's when the Illustrated London News, I think, began. Well, this one's 1853, isn't it, that we're looking at right now? So I think that's that's about the time when they started to put pictures in to bring the news to life, really.
Yeah, I want to say it was in the 20th century before they could put photographs in, but I don't know that for sure.
It probably was around about then, I'd have thought. I mean, have you learned anything from illustrations in any of these, as opposed to just the text?
Oh, they had, there were some illustrations of, for example, the London Central Telegraph Office.
Right.
So I could get an idea of what the building looked like. And that building still survives too, although it was bombed during World War II and had to be halfway rebuilt. But you can see what a lot of buildings look like at the time. So I found that very helpful.
Okay. Is there another illustration that we can pull up just to... the comet one's okay, but it's not the most interesting of pictures.
No. Let me see.
But that one, the Penny Journal Illustrated, that's an impressive building on the front there.
There you go.
That's the Central Telegraph Office, is it?
It says the new Central Telegraph Office, St. Martin's Le Grand. So yeah, there it is. And so I could picture what it looked like in their day, including the omnibuses disgorging people who are going there to work. They had thousands of telegraphers in that office, which was amazing to me.
And that's another gem of these street scenes, particularly. It's not only the building that you're getting to see, but also the detail of what's actually happening in the street, because the artist is representing everyday life on the street in their time.
That's right.
So as you say, so if you zoom in on that, we can see a little bit of the detail, can't we?
Yeah.
So you've got the omnibus there. You've got street sellers, absolutely, with stalls. Hansom cab. There's a cab there with VR on the side of it. So what would that be? Would that be Post? The postal service, the one on the left-hand side, yeah. And then, of course, you also get to see a little bit of the fashions as well, the sort of the styles that people were wearing at the time. Yeah, the top hats and the long dresses. And this is 1870s that we're looking at now. So it's a bit later on from the 1850s. That's fascinating. So what would you say is perhaps the most surprising fact that you've discovered in your research, either from the newspaper archive or not? Is there anything that's really jumped out at you when you looked at the sort of the historical facts you're digging into?
I think what mostly surprises me in a general way is how modern the wording feels. Despite being 1900s, I come across words and phrases that to me sound very modern, but they were, used in those times as well. Okay.
Can you think of a particular example?
Crocodile tears, I think, was one of them.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I know that sounds a little weird, but
well, no, it's not, because when you're writing a historical novel and you're putting words into the mouth of your characters, and if they're using an expression like crocodile tears, if you're taking it seriously, then of course what you should do is double check, and actually, would they have said crocodile tears in whatever time period you're writing in? And sometimes it's surprising how old some of these expressions are, whereas other expressions, of course, are much more modern. And expressions or even individual words. There's I was trying to think of an example now. There was a word the other day that came up that someone used in a Regency novel, and Rachel queried it, and the word didn't exist until the early 20th century. So, but there we are. Never mind. I can't remember that one.
Yes, and I made a whole list. I read one of Trollope's novels, and there were so many phrases in there that surprised me. I ended up writing them all down, and I think that's where I came across crocodile tears.
Crocodile tears, yeah.
Or she threw him over, to say they ditched someone, things like that.
Yeah. So do you find yourself looking the etymology up online for these sorts of things?
Yes, I do. There is a website called Etym Online, ETYM Online. .com, and that is a great source. It tells you kind of the year it's first known to have been used. Yes.
Although, of course, sometimes these websites aren't entirely up to date or accurate. I know sometimes we've come across a reference to because there are various etymology websites and dictionary sites, and sometimes they quote the earliest usage, but actually you can sometimes find actual earlier usages.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not
true.
so they're not 100% accurate. It's like all research, isn't it? It's only as good as the research that's been done at that point and who's done it.
Another way I search for word usage is in googlebooks.com, because there are so many. They're now out of copyright, so they're all on Google Books, and you can search words that way too. If I can find it in a book from 1880, I know I can use it.
Yes, yeah, Google Books is a fantastic resource, and again, there's hundreds of books on there. So thanks for showing us that glimpse into the newspaper archive, and it is a fantastic resource, and encourage anybody else who's watching this to you can sign up for a free account. So there is a paid for account, but you can sign up for the free version and have a look. So which is highly recommend doing that. So what would you say, in all the research you've done, what would you say, Jennifer, has been your biggest research challenge?
My biggest challenge was reminding myself that, as accurate as I am working to be, this is still historical fiction. I had, when I was writing The Captain's Daughter, which is set backstage at the original production of HMS Pinafore by Gilbert and Sullivan, they were preparing to do the next show, which was The Pirates of Penzance, and they were going to do one single production of it in, I think it's pronounced Paynton. It's near Torquay.
Yeah.
And so there were some details that I had to change in order to make my plot go the way I wanted to go. And that was the first time when I really had to do that, even though that was like my fourth book in.
Right.
I actually wrestled with myself for a month.
Yeah.
Before I told myself, this is historical fiction. And it's changing minor details that the reader wouldn't even realize.
Yes.
It's not the same as, for example, giving Henry VIII 4 wives instead of 6, you know. So it was just some minor things that I had to change. And since that time, I've been a little easier on myself to change what I know are insignificant details in order to suit the plot.
Yeah, that's important, isn't it? At the end of the day, it is fiction. But you also, as you said earlier on, some of your readers, many of your readers, they're wanting to learn a bit of history as they go along. That's part of the joy of reading a historical novel. And what you don't want to do is teach them things that are wrong, frankly. And there's of course plenty of historical fiction, both in books and on the screen, which does miseducate people. I think we can all think of good examples of that. Have you ever had any of your readers come back to you and say, I think I found a mistake here, Jennifer?
No, the only thing that people, I've occasionally had a British reader, tell me if I've got a word wrong or used something incorrectly.
Right.
Because I try very hard to sound English when I write.
Yes.
And so I was not aware that they don't really speak in terms of blocks, like city blocks.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we don't. You're absolutely right.
This reader told me, so I started to be more careful about saying, on the next street or the next corner,
Brilliant.
things like that.
Yeah. That's a really good example. That's a good example of where, yes, those are phrases that we just don't use. But as you said, nobody's particularly come back to you and picked up on any major historical flaws, which is great.
Yeah. And I think, in the example that I gave, that production did take place, and it was very casual with very little rehearsal and costumes and things. It was just something they did to guard the copyright of the thing, because they were so concerned about the piracy, ironically, of the Gilbert and Sullivan over in America. And so this was a way to preserve the copyright. And so that whole part of it was true. And so the readers will learn about that kind of interesting aspect of the history. And if I change some of the details about who was involved in that production, that's minor.
Absolutely. Yes. And yes, a lot of, again, I'm not an expert on the copyright laws, but certainly earlier in the 19th century, an awful lot of British books were just taken and copied in the States because there were no copyright laws.
Right. Dickens had a terrible trouble with that. Gilbert and Sullivan had an awful time with that. They had all sorts of pirated versions of their shows over there.
Yeah. So when did copyright become a thing in the US? Then do you happen to know that, as you seem to be a bit more informed about it?
No, I think it was probably, it must have been in the 20th century, but
Really?
I don't really know the details.
Have you ever discovered after you've written a book that you've actually made a bit of a mistake with the history?
Yes, I have, and I can't remember now. But not really too often. I work so hard to try to get it right that if I miss something, it would be, again, pretty minor.
And do you put a historical note in the back of your books for your readers to look at?
I do always put a historical note, because as a reader, I love that.
Yes.
And so I just kind of assume my readers will like that too. And whenever I put real life, on almost all my books, I try to put real life people and or events into my books. And I'm always very careful to be faithful to the best I know that person was and what they would have said and done. And on most of the times, I use actual words from their letters or their autobiographical material.
Excellent.
So that I think of my books as being filled with a lot of quiet history, things that I know actually were said or done, but that the reader might not stop to think about it when they're reading the story.
That sounds incredibly thorough. Are you planning to write any more books?
I am. I am actually very seriously considering leaping forward a few decades to another period that has fascinated me since I was young, and that is the 1920s.
Okay.
And the great age of transatlantic ocean travel.
Right.
And in the early 20th century, I was fascinated by the 1920s, that wonderful period after the Great War and before the Depression and all the horribleness that came later. And I think it would be interesting to set a series in that time period. I think we're far enough out now that it's starting to feel like history for people. You know, it's becoming more popular now. You know, when I was younger, no one ever thought much, at least in America, about World War I, the Great War.
Yeah, well, I guess not in just a few years' time, when people talk about the 20s, they won't be talking about the 1920s.
Don't remind me.
So yeah, the 1920s are certainly getting further and further away. So in terms of the things that you read for pleasure these days, what are that? You talked earlier on about Mary Stewart and other authors. What's on your reading list these days?
I'm reading a lot of history books about the 1920s, and I'm reading some books that were actually written in the 1920s, particularly a book called The Frantic Atlantic, which is about what to do, say, act, all the details you need to know in order to do a transatlantic trip. And I'm reading some books that were set, some novels that were set in that time period or in the early 20th century. I'm reading a book called Yours is the Night, which is set during World War I. So,
right.
That is kind of what's on my book stand right now.
If you were giving tips, and you've already given loads of tips, by the way, with this as we talk, but if you're giving tips to somebody who's thinking about writing historical fiction, what would be one or two of your top pieces of advice?
Make a lot of use of Google Books if you can, to look up all sorts of articles and novels. If you are in a time period where that's happening, you know, obviously with the 19th century, I had an endless supply. And I got really good advice from a historical romance writer when I was first starting out. She also adored reading Victorian fiction or 19th century fiction. And she said, read those novels and look at what is the wallpaper, is the way she put it. Like, what things do they take for granted? How do they act? What's sort of normal for them? And you can get a really great sense of the time period that way. And of course, I also used it for the vocabulary, as I said.
Yeah. And it's always interesting in when you're reading fiction that's written in the 19th century. Of course, for them it wasn't historical fiction. For them it was contemporary. That's
right. And so you can really see, as I said, what did they not even think twice about in terms of
Yes.
how they acted or interacted with people?
Yes. So it's partly what's not said as much as what is said.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you. Where can people find you, Jennifer, online?
Online, I'm at jenniferdelamere.com. And I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the usual places.
All the social
and
media platforms.
Yes, and they're all linked on my website. And I also have always done a Pinterest page with photographs of inspirations for my books. If anybody enjoys Pinterest and wants to sort of get a visual of what my novels are about.
Okay. So it sounds like you're sharing quite a lot online, which is really good.
Yeah, it's kind of a requirement for authors these days, isn't it? To kind of be out there online. I do enjoy interacting with readers, especially most of them seem to be on Facebook and Instagram. And I enjoy talking with them.
Do you have your own Facebook group? I know some authors have their own Facebook groups.
No, I don't have a group. I just have my page. So.
And people can interact with you. Are there any particular Facebook groups where you are active? Because again, I know some authors are active in certain groups.
I'm a part of the Historical Novel Society,
right?
And they have a Facebook page that is open to anyone,
right?
And then there's also a wonderful page called the British Inspirational Historical Fiction page, which I am a part of, is that one as well, both as an author and as a reader.
Right. Excellent.
So those are my favorite pages on Facebook groups.
Yeah, groups. Brilliant.
I think the Historical Novel Society, which, they have a conference every year that's available for readers to attend as well as writers.
Okay.
And they alternate every other year. They're either in England or somewhere in the U.S. So no matter where you live, you can participate at some point if you want.
Okay. That's fascinating. And I'm assuming that there's an online version of that as well. So even if you can't get to it in person, presumably there's an online stream that they run.
They have done that in the last few years. I don't know if they'll continue doing that.
Yeah. Well, hope a lot of these things, I hope, will continue doing the online stuff, because not everyone, even if it's in your home country, it doesn't necessarily mean you can get there easily.
The wonderful thing about the Historical Novel Society, you can join that for $50 a year, and every other month they send out a complete catalog of reviews, historical novel reviews, and it's a great way to add to your to-be-read pile. But they're broken down by time period, the reviews are. So whatever strikes your fancy, from prehistorical to present day, or mostly present, you can find what you like. Yeah,
well, that's fascinating. That's really good. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Was there anything else that you particularly wanted to say before we sort of sign off?
No, I think I'm just really excited that you came to talk to me about my favorite thing, which is historical research. And I hope that my readers will find them, entertaining and not just informational, but that they will enjoy the history that I kind of seeped through it like a tea bag.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for spending a bit of time with me today, Jennifer. And all the best with your sounds like your 1920s series. Thank you,
Andrea. It's really been a pleasure.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.